Hello, my name is Will Norman. I'm a reader in American Literature and Culture at the University of Kent, and I'm also director of the Center for American Studies. My current research project is about complicity in American thought and culture since World War II. Once one begins to think about complicity, one sees it everywhere. Deriving etymologically from the Latin word complicare, meaning to fold, complicity shares a root with our modern words complicate and complex. If one is complicit, one is folded into a larger system and becomes part of a complex situation. In our modern use of the word, complicity conventionally carries with it a negative valence, in which individuals are folded into a structure such as an institution which causes harm. Often the complicit subject wishes to repudiate aspects of this system, but finds it difficult to do so or is unwilling. In such a case, the term complicity takes on a pejorative cast. The recognition that the institution one has been folded into is in fact nefarious is the moment when compliance with the rules governing that institution shades into complicity. And this recognition demands various forms of rethinking of one's position within the system, of the ethics of one's actions and language, and of one's relationship to others. The process of rethinking one's position and relationship to the world can be seen as a positive one, bringing about new understanding and insights. But the feelings that correspond to states of complicity tend to be unhappy ones: shame, guilt, frustration. These can lead to states of inaction and even hopelessness. One is stuck, one is entangled. Examples of contemporary complicity are not hard to find and go right to the heart of our lives as political beings in a liberal society. And perhaps the most obvious one is climate change. We all contribute varying levels of CO2 to the atmosphere and bear some responsibility for environmental degradation. We buy and consume products manufactured under labor conditions that we may find abhorrent. We perform a role in institutions such as the nation state, such as the university, that take actions we know to cause harm in the world. Often the choice we face is a stark one: accept complicity or make a sacrifice, lose your job, end up in jail, give up the security you receive from those institutions in return for your compliance. And in my research, I'm interested in discovering a longer history for these predicaments that relate to complicity, which we've become so used to that in fact we're barely able to see them. My hope is that engaging with the histories of complicity might help us to understand our own. And I do that chiefly in relation to the United States, my own area of expertise. And what I've found is that questions of complicity become prominent in American thought and culture at certain points in its history, when values of capitalist, liberal democracy come under particular pressure. And one of these historical moments corresponds to the crises of the mid-19th century. This was when accelerated capitalist development, conflict over the institutions of slavery, and imperialist expansion into Mexico created a climate of anxiety over citizens' relations to these issues. A wave of radicals adopted positions of radical non-complicity in response, in which they tried to disentangle themselves from those folds of complicity. Two of the most powerful episodes of 19th century American literature correspond to this development, and one is Herman Melville's 1853 short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, in which a clerk employed on Wall Street refuses to complete his tasks with the famous phrase, "I would prefer not to," refusing to work for the legal institution that employs him. He ends up incarcerated in the Tombs, a term which was then given to the Municipal Detention Center in New York. And another episode is Henry David Thoreau's 1849 essay, Resistance to Civil Government, in which he describes his refusal to comply with a state institution, which was then conducting an aggressive imperial war with Mexico, and also failing to challenge the practice of chattel slavery at home. And in his essay, Thoreau declares, quote, I cannot for an instant recognize that political institution as my government, which is the slave's government also. As a gesture of severance from that state institution, then, Thoreau refused to pay his taxes and was sent to jail. The mid-19th century example is instructive for us in the way that it highlights a certain kind of radical response to complicity, which is that of renunciation. If one is folded into a harmful system, the response, simply enough, is to refuse compliance. Bartleby and Thoreau at these moments effectively washed their hands of the problem with a rhetorical gesture of renunciation. But on the other hand, they also both end up incarcerated by the institutions they refuse. So these are, in some sense, Pyrrhic victories, in which whatever victory is won comes at a cost that makes it look rather like defeat. They also model for us the consistent themes in the history of complicity which recur again and again: racism and capitalism. The next moment at which complicity was raised to the surface and became a point of common debate in American culture came in the period immediately after World War II. One of the key interventions made here was Dwight MacDonald's essay, The Responsibility of Peoples. It was published in the spring of 1945, just as reports about the liberation of Nazi death camps began to filter back to the United States. MacDonald took this as an opportunity and an occasion to pose once again the question that Thoreau had asked 100 years earlier. In what sense, he asked, can the people of a state be held responsible for the actions taken by their government? Running against the grain of public debate on the topic, MacDonald's inquiry was not limited to those Germans who had failed to resist the rise of National Socialism. He argued that if the German people were to be held responsible for the atrocities perpetrated by the state, then a group he calls we, the peoples of Russia, England, and America, he says, must also take on a big load of responsibility. While maintaining the historical distinctiveness of Nazi atrocities, MacDonald nevertheless pressed in his essay for an expansive and comparative framework for thinking about state-authorized violence, which refused any kind of simplistic nationalist impulses or unreflective righteousness. It is a terrible fact, he went on, but it is a fact that few people have the imagination or the moral sensitivity to get very excited about actions they don't participate in themselves. MacDonald saw 1945 as a moment at which a new, global, and conscious chapter in the history of morality might be opened up. He saw the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples in Australia, the British enabling of mass famine in colonial India, the excessive violence of the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion in China, and the Jim Crow laws of the southern United States, as all posing a challenge to citizens of the Allied powers. How can one develop the imaginative capacity necessary to overcome the vast distances separating individuals from the harms that they are nevertheless folded into? It's worth remembering, however, that the we MacDonald urges to take responsibility is in fact coded more or less explicitly as white, while the state-authorized violence he describes is almost all visited upon people of color. Complicity becomes then, in his analysis, a challenge not just for any imagination, but for an anemic, white, liberal imagination that desires conciliation with what it might know but not experience. MacDonald's essay then asks similar questions to Thoreau a century previously, but his answers are much more guarded. Much of the power of Thoreau's essay, Resistance to Civil Government, came from the example of action in the world which accompanied it. Thoreau refused to pay his tax and was jailed as a result, though only for one night. His response to complicity was largely individualist and pragmatic. One wished to avoid it, and one took the necessary steps. MacDonald's, on the other hand, is more invested in thought itself and imagination in particular, demanding a recognition of complicity, but without spelling out what his readers were to do about it. In this sense, it belongs very much to its historical moment in mid-20th century America, when white liberal thinkers entered into a kind of paralysis, their complicity generating sophisticated new analyses that could not, however, be easily translated into action in the world. What it did achieve, however, was the potential for complicity to be reconceived collectively as solidarity. This facet of MacDonald's thought was most clearly developed in the work of his friend Hannah Arendt, who worked in the same period. Arendt was one of the American post-war's most incisive thinkers on the topic of complicity. Her writing on it eventually made her infamous when her 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, coined the term the banality of evil and suggested that structures of modern bureaucracy had overturned conventional ways of understanding guilt and responsibility, making those furthest from the act of violence more responsible for it than those wielding the weapon. The Eichmann book created immense controversy for the way it undermined orthodox thinking about who was responsible for the Holocaust, arguing that the folds of complicity extended much further than had previously been recognized. But 18 years earlier, in January 1945, just a few months before MacDonald had written his piece, Arendt made the startling claim, following her reflections on the discovery of the Nazi atrocities, in an essay called The German Guilt, and I quote, "For the idea of humanity, when purged of all sentimentality, has the very serious consequence that in one form or another, men must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by men, and that all nations share the onus of evil committed by all others. Shame at being a human being is the purely individual and still non-political expression of this insight." Now, this is a crucial statement in the history of thinking about complicity because of the radical way it conceives of a universal responsibility for crime and for evil. It has the effect of making complicity a condition of being human, rather than, as Thoreau conceived of it, an abhorrent state to be avoided. Like MacDonald's claims, it very much belongs to its time, reflecting a mid-century impulse born from the conclusion of World War II and the energies of the decolonization movements towards an internationalist humanism. But there's something else important about this statement, which is the way she engages with the idea of feeling as a crucial component of complicity. Arendt was suspicious of feelings, believing them to be a threat to the operation of reason, clouding one's mind. And she's anxious here to purge our collective sense of responsibility of any shred of sentimentality. But I'm actually more interested in her evocation of shame as what she calls the purely individual and still non-political expression of this insight. Arendt notices and foregrounds for us something we can recognize in our current moment, the way that complicity can so readily be experienced as a negative feeling. Shame in this case, shame at being human, shame at sharing a species identity, is paradoxically a very isolating experience. One is atomized, one is alone. The challenge that she identifies is to find a political correlative to that shame. And what is interesting is that she understands that process as an overcoming of individualism. This vision of a complicit humanism was swiftly threatened by the onset of the Cold War and the ideological fault lines that came to divide the map of the world, as the United States rose to the position of a global superpower. Arendt gradually distanced herself from her position, preferring, as she put it, to focus on more manageable lessons about Holocaust culpability which were learned in the courtrooms. It certainly did not survive the tumultuous political and social years of the long 1960s in the United States, which saw her defend the practice of segregated schools in the southern states on the principle of freedom to discriminate in the social sphere, a principle which she understood to be fundamental to a liberal democracy. But the point I'd like to conclude on is that Arendt voiced her radical vision of complicit solidarity at the very moment when liberalism, with its emphasis on individual freedoms over collective ones, established a powerful new consensus in the United States, energized by the ideological demands of the Cold War and anti-communism. In this context, it's hardly surprising that its utopian promise was not taken up. The claim I've been leading up to then is this: the histories of complicity that I've sketched, accompanied as they are by feelings of guilt and fear, of isolation and shame, are themselves histories of liberal subjectivity in the modern world. They reveal to us clearly enough one of the fundamental weaknesses of liberal subjectivity. That is, its tendency to internalize political and social conflicts in the world as private crises of conscience, rather than as prompts to collective action. This is what Arendt recognizes, however fleetingly in that quotation, when she writes of shame as the purely individual and non-political expression of universal responsibility. What is required then as now is a history of complicity that might help us out of this impasse. Thank you.